All right, hi everyone. Here are the notes for Microevolution. So if you're looking through the notes, you will see that I've compiled some of the stuff that we have done so far, right? We've talked about the virus in general. We've talked about some of the epidemiology and how the virus is being tracked. We talked about the immune system. Some of you have done a lab. And we were also focusing on why the virus was called what it was. And if you did the flu, you did slightly different activities. But either way, we were looking at the different viruses, where they come from, how they're spread. And now we've come to the part where we've narrowed down the fact that it's coming from animals passing to humans. And now we're basically around this part with microevolution, Darwin and Wallace. This is where we're heading, so we'll talk about that later. So I'm going to skim through the next couple of slides, but you have these posted, so take a look at them in detail. Right, what I did was I basically compiled the questions that you posted initially, and I've been working through them, trying to make sure that you guys will get the answers. And again, for the flu unit, this is slightly different, but it's along the same lines. So some of the takeaways from the article, again, skim through this when you get a chance. Talked about epidemiology. Did a number of different Zoom calls. We did our Amoeba Sisters things for either the viruses or for coronavirus in particular. We also did a mapping activity in BLAST. And now you just finished the Darwin video. So hopefully you did that at Puzzle, and we're going to be talking about what exactly microevolution is. So if you did the video, you were basically focusing on Darwin. But before Darwin, people basically believed that species were placed on Earth as is, and no one knew anything about evolution. So in the mid-1700s, some of the scientists started finding fossils, and they basically started realizing that the Earth is older than they thought it was. And then one of the first scientists to bring up evolution was Lamarck. So some of you, or hopefully all of you, have heard of Lamarck back in middle school. And I always say when you see a giraffe, you're thinking Lamarck, because his idea was that there were giraffes, and as they were getting hungry, they were basically eating leaves off of trees, and they kept on stretching their necks and stretching their necks and stretching their necks, and over time, those giraffes got taller. So his idea was acquired traits. We now know that's not true. We've known that for a while. And I always say this is basically like saying if you cut off your arm, your child will be born with no arm. We know that's not true, right? Unless there's a mutation in the genes that's passed on, we know that that is not correct. So again, you watched your video on Charles Darwin. He was an English naturalist. He sailed on a ship, and in 1859, quite a few years after his initial idea and his initial research, he published a book called On the Origin of Species. I heard it's kind of dry. I have it on a shelf, but I haven't read it. But I know a number of people who have, and obviously the theory of evolution is brilliant, but I heard the book is kind of boring. And again, he traveled around the world for over 5 years, and he observed a number of different things, right? And some of the takeaways were that he looked at a number of different fossils of extinct armadillos in South America, right? He visited the Galapagos. He was fascinated by some of the birds and everything else that he saw. And he started noticing how there are similarities and differences between the organisms found on the island versus on the mainland. And that brought him to his big idea, right? And again, we're focusing on populations. So some of you took environmental science last year and you have a better idea of what populations are. But keep in mind, we're not necessarily focusing on individuals. We're trying to look at how the population changes over time. Right? So some of the notes from the video is we know that all organisms have some variations in their DNA. Right? We talked about this before. We used the word allele. So one example of that was people with brown eyes versus people with blue eyes or green eyes, right? Variation in skin color is important. That's all because of DNA, right? And if you're looking at different animals, they also have different variations in their traits. So it could be fur color, It could be slightly different wing size or beak size or shape or something like that, right? But it has to be a variation that comes from their DNA, which results in a slightly different protein, which results in a different difference between the organisms in the same population, right? And selection will happen through death and birth of new organisms. So a small subset of the population, right? So a small group would have to die, and then the ones who survive will be the ones who will reproduce. And then we're also talking about the word fitness, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But we have to think about survival of the fittest, right? And for most of you, that means that it's the organisms or members of the population that are literally the strongest or the fastest, but that's actually not true, right? Fitness is measured by who has more babies, because when you have babies, you pass on your genes, and hopefully those babies eventually grow up and can reproduce as well. So fitness is all about the number of offsprings or children that you have. So if we're looking at evolution by natural selection, there are a number of different things that we have to consider, right? There is variation in populations. So like I mentioned, variation is all about the differences in DNA, which will result in differences in alleles. Those are different versions of the gene, right? And those differences don't have to be large, right? It could be you have a whole bunch of different green bugs, but some are more green and some are less green, and that could mean the difference between survival and being eaten and death, right? There has to be a challenge in the environment, which means that something has to change, right? The traits, like I mentioned, the variations, like we're talking about here, they're already present. So once the environment has a small change in it, or a large change, depending on what it is, you will see that some individuals are better able to survive, right? So those variations are helping the organisms adapt to the environment, right? Nothing's magically appearing, but you can now see that a small group from the same population, it's the same species, species living in the same place at the same time, a small number of them are better able to survive, which means that they're better able to pass on their traits, right? Those members will survive, they will reproduce, and then they will compete. Right, so over time, you can see that the organisms with the adaptation, that beneficial trait, will survive and pass on those favorable, meaning good genes or traits, to their offsprings, right? And once those traits are passed on, you can see that the populations evolve. And again, this isn't a huge change. This is a micro, meaning small change. So it could be you had a whole bunch of organisms that were various shades of green, right, if we're still talking about bugs. The light green bugs got eaten, so now you only have medium green and dark green, right? It's still evolution, even though you don't have a new species or anything. It's just that your population and the traits within that population are changing, right? So as I mentioned, what is a population? It's a group of organisms from the same species living in the same place at the same time. So one example of that is a bunch of deer, let's say, living in Highland Park. And some of those deer are more gray and some of those deer are less gray, or maybe some of those deer are shorter or taller, which could make a difference between what type of graves they're eating, right? Some of them could be faster or slower if we're talking about, let's say, running away from a predator. So the variation in that population could be very, very small, but the important thing is that the population has to be the same species, same time, same place. Right? And like I mentioned, survival of the fittest, you have what is an adaptation. So an adaptation is something that will help the certain members of the species survive. So it could be a certain fur color, right? It could be how fast or slow an organism runs, right? So maybe you have a group of deer and some of them run faster than others, right? An adaptation could be something like the size of a beak or how it curves, or how it can open seeds or whatnot, right? And the most important thing is it's not magic, right? It has to be present in the population. So if you have a species with wings, the wing span, right, how wide the wings are, how they work can differ. Some can have longer wings, some can have shorter wings, but you can't just assume that if the environment changes, that a species is going to grow wings, right? That's magic. That's not evolution. So if we're looking at fitness, like I mentioned before, again, it's the ability to pass on your genes. So it's all about having more babies and having those babies survive, because the idea is to have them eventually reproduce and pass on their genes that come from you, that came from your parents and your grandparents and whatnot. Right, so now we're going to be going into the different mechanisms of evolution. We have genetic drift, we have gene flow, we have non-random mating, artificial selection, which is a part of non-random mating, but it's human-made. And then we have mutations and natural selection.